In tonight's Dateline Defense, an update on Middle East diplomacy. We start in Syria. Today, humanitarian aid convoys delivered food and medical supplies to thousands of Syrians living in besieged towns just outside Damascus. For more, I'm joined by Lieutenant Colonel Anthony Shaffer. He's a CIA-trained senior intelligence operations officer, best-selling author, and senior fellow at the London Center for Policy Research.
Hey, Morris.
Tony, the United States and Russia agreed on a ceasefire in Syria yesterday. It appears to be holding. How long will that last?
Well, it depends on all parties how serious they are about allowing this aid to get in. Frankly, it's long overdue, but this is the key. And remember this, the Russians are the ones who are really pushing this deal. The American side had to give up every requirement and defer to the Russians. This is really a caving in by our side, which is not all bad by the fact that it looks like, at least for now, Morris, that the aid's going to get in. I don't expect it to last more than a couple of weeks by the fact that you have people out there, elements out there that cannot be controlled by the government or by our side or by the Russians. So I think inevitably you're going to see a return to arms probably within about 2 weeks.
I'm afraid you're right. Talk about Russia. The Kremlin appears to be in the middle of an anti-Obama propaganda campaign. Right. Ads have popped up outside Moscow claiming Obama is responsible for tens of thousands of deaths in Syria, calling him a killer, even giving him devil horns, as you can see. Right. An opposition candidate inside Russia says Vladimir Putin wants to distract people from his country's struggling economy. We wonder how long that opposition leader is going to stick around. What do you make of all this? I mean, it's effective propaganda. Obama as the devil in Russia.
Well, it's very clear that Putin's numbers are very high regarding approval. So, yes, this is another distraction to keep the people away from focusing on the bad nature of the economy. The people are actually very emboldened by the fact that they see other Russia doing a lot. And Morris, let me be direct here. This is what comes psychologically from leading from behind. President Obama has essentially demurred. He's completely abandoned taking any sort of clear stricture saying what the policies of the United States are or are not. This was reflected 2 weeks ago by Ambassador Ryan Crocker in testimony talking about the fact that we have abandoned the Sunni allies. Syria, Russia, the Iranians are all seen on the march going forward. Russia's simply stipulating, saying things that they believe to be true, and there's no counter propaganda. So essentially, Morris, the Russians are owning the space. So if you say nothing to counter that message is what stands, and that message is what we see now coming across from over there to us.
Sounds like a similar tactics going on with the U.S. presidential race, not making any comparisons, but when you've got certain people driving the day with their own versions of propaganda and nobody's countering that like Obama is against Putin, right. Russians look like the winners in their own country.
Absolutely, and that's what the idea here is. Unless there's some, and during the Cold War, by the way, Morris, we had things like Voice of America. Sure. We had a number of things which were actually very effective in countering Soviet propaganda. Apparently, everybody who worked in those programs has long since retired, or there's no concern, because clearly right now, the Pentagon, CIA, all the other elements of our government which have been trained to do this are completely silent, which to me is does not bode well for the future.
There's also trouble, Tony, Bruni, north of Syria. Today, Turkey's prime minister accused Russia, Syria, Islamic State militants, and the U.S.-backed Syrian Kurdish militia of attempting to form a terror belt along Turkey's border with Syria. That's quite a list. Who does Turkey support?
Turkey supports Turkey. Turkey is in this game for themselves, and we recognize from a number of sources and watching the ISIS thing grow, Turkey has been an erstwhile ally. They've not always been as with us as they should. To be frank here, they've actually economically supported ISIS to grow to the threat it is. So Turkey calling these suicide belts and tracking them back to the Kurds, I don't believe it for a minute. I think that this actually goes back to their own internal problems. I think playing both sides of the fence is resulting in destabilizing their own country, much like Pakistan. Pakistan's had the same problem with the Taliban. Right. You had the Afghan Taliban, who then became the Pakistan Taliban, who went after the government. I think that's what we're seeing here. I think we're seeing radical Islam going after Turkey in a more direct way than Turkey's ready for.
Let's look to the east now. On Friday, Iran holds parliamentary elections. The country's most prominent reformist candidate, Mohammad Reza Aref, says jobs are priority number one. He's popular among women and young voters, Tony. What do you expect from this election? And how will the results impact international diplomacy?
Well, obviously, anytime you can do something that benefits the population, that's a good thing. Jobs are very important. This is an economically depressed area of the world, so it's very clear that anything they can do in that vein will be good. I just don't believe he'll be able to deliver on the promises. That's always a problem with politicians. They overpromise, underdeliver, and I think that's what's going to happen.
You bet. Happens in every country. Getting back to something you were talking about in the Middle East, representatives from Afghanistan, Pakistan, China, and the U.S. met in Kabul today. Their goal is to end Afghanistan's 15-year war with the Taliban. They announced direct talks between those two parties starting next week. Put this into context for us. Is it a breakthrough?
Well, we've been seeing this for the past 15 years.
Yeah.
The idea here is that, yes, ultimately the solution of the Afghan conflict is the reassimilation of the Taliban into the political process. Let me be blunt. The government initially outlawed the Taliban. Therefore, if you are not part of the political process, you will attack it. Therefore, what they're trying to do now is reconcile that. I see this, Morris, as a step towards the Northern Ireland-style peace process. Basically, we have Pashto fighting Pashto. The government of Afghanistan and the Taliban are all essentially Pashto in some form. We had the same thing with Christians in Northern Ireland. You had the Irish, Republican, the Catholics and the Provost, the Protestants. So the same basic thing here is you got to find a way for a path of reconciliation.
Why is China involved?
China actually has a border with Afghanistan,
right?
And plus they've actually invested heavily in some of the mineral. Basically, they have 2 copper mines that they are now getting minerals from, and other things that they've invested in. So the Chinese actually are trying to be a helpful part of the reconciliation process. Nothing's going to happen without the Chinese and the Pakistanis, and frankly, the Iranians have to have a little bit of this too because of the border with them and us. I'd like to believe that this is a step in the right direction, but again, we have to have some level of military support, military operations ongoing to make sure that the Taliban do not, by force, retake over the country. And this is where we have to walk a very fine line of maintaining support for the central government at the same time not being the threat to the Taliban that they attack us constantly.
The world is like a giant bubbling pot, boiling here, boiling there. Lieutenant Colonel Anthony Shaffer, Senior Fellow at the London Center for Policy Research. Thanks, Tony.
Thank you, Morris.